Welcome back, I am John P. Today we are going to be talking about 5 tips that you can use to determine if your watch may be a lemon. Now, what is a lemon? In cars in the United States, a lemon is a car that just has a problem or perhaps will have problems going into the future. Now, there's a couple different definitions, but generally, this is an item that has a problem or may have a problem. Now, when we're talking about watches, things can be intricate, much like vehicles, but oftentimes they can be solved with new parts. There's not combustion engine, but there are moving parts in these watches which do cause issues in other parts. And so I'm going to be sharing you some signs that you can use specifically that we also use at delraywatch.com during preliminary inspections before they go to our classically trained watchmakers. I always recommend that you do have a good classically trained watchmaker that you do trust, or at least you purchase watches from watch dealers that you trust, because as you'll see by these signs that I'm going to share with you some tips, they're not always cut and dry. They're not always straightforward. They're rules of thumbs in certain cases, and sometimes it just comes from experience, but you need to have the watchmaker decase, open the watch, and look at it. But let's get right into it, and I'll share with you some tips that you can use when buying a watch, and maybe you will decline purchasing that specific example. Now, the first tip that I would recommend is to wind the watch. I see so many people don't even bother with this, but this is something that I always do. It's something I always have done, and it's something that you really need to know because it's going to give you an initial feel and a look at what's going on inside of the watch, right? We can examine the watch, every specific part on the outside, but if we don't know what's going on the inside, that's very concerning because it may not even have a movement, right? I mean, go figure, it's possible. We've seen crazier things come in through the door at Del Rey Watch, but nonetheless, unscrew the crown if it's a Rolex or has a screw down crown, and just wind it, see how it feels. When we're talking about Rolexes going bad over the years, especially older Rolexes, there's a specific piece in the watch called a reversing wheel, and that translates the manual wind into the energy through the automatic winding system, which the Rolex movement was originally intended to use. By the swinging of your arm, it would wind the watch and store the energy in that way. Well, they have a reversing wheel system, and the more that the watch has been wound in this manner over time, the more likely these wheels are to break down and pieces fall off and get into the movement. So it's always great to give it a wind. Every movement's going to wind a little bit differently, but if you hear something very bizarre or you hear a piece in there, even shake it around a little bit. I know it sounds silly, but sometimes screws come out. Things like this happen, especially when talking about vintage watches. So give it a wind, see how it feels. Every movement is different. There are some very clunky movements out there, and honestly, a very properly serviced and taken care of Valjoux 72 movement sometimes feels a little chunky, especially to those that haven't, been able to take advantage of playing with some of these watches over the course of time. So something to do. We'll go into the next ones, the tips that I have here for you. And it's something to keep in mind is when you start pairing these tips together, that's really where the issue comes into play. And you can really take a step back and say, wow, do I really need this specific example of the watch? So it's not each individual sign, but you start putting them together and it makes a more compelling case of why maybe you should step back from the watch or ask for some service records, because it'll definitely save you in the long run. And the next one is going to be something looks crooked on the watch. This happens all the time in Omega Speedmasters. We get Omega Speedmasters in the door at Del Rey Watch all the time, and sometimes the dials are crooked. Omega is a big brand for this to happen. Omega sold case parts for decades. Omega sold dials for decades. Watchmakers could obtain Omega parts for such a long time. Now, things have changed. There's a much strict and stringent process to get a parts account with Omega, and even then they don't give you everything from what I understand, but there were so many parts floating out there that you'd have mom and pop jewelry stores, nothing against them, but you'd have them replacing dials some cases, and service centers that maybe were not the right watchmaker at that service center, unauthorized service center, putting these things in there, and things are a little bit off, and that's something you see with Omega a lot, especially older Omega, but it happens with Rolex as well, because parts float out there, they fetch premiums, and so many other brands. So if something looks crooked, take a closer look. get a loop system, a magnifying system. They're on Amazon, they're on other platforms where you can buy things, and it will save you headaches in the future. Keep in mind that with vintage, especially rarer vintage, there can be some variance, especially when talking about chronograph hands, things like that. The gears break down, you may not be able to get a replacement piece, and there will be some wiggle room for that watch. So keep in mind with vintage, things get a little bit gray sometimes, but for modern, certainly things should line up. Now next, poor timing rate is a problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that this can't be fixed easily by the watchmaker, but once again, it's slowly building a case for perhaps stepping back from the watch. Now, if the watch is keeping bad timing, let's say out of 14 seconds per day, which was Audemars Piguet's standard for a very long time for non-chronometer certified watches. But let's say if it's keeping well out of 14 seconds per day, which I think is okay, but you want to get close to COSC as possible, especially when talking modern watches. That's something to keep an eye out for, but more so, what we need to look at is the amplitude, and you can measure this using a time grapher. They're on Amazon, they're $100. You can buy them other places, watch supply stores, but you put the watch on this and it has a little microphone and it can actually read and listen to the ticking and the beating of the watch. Now, I'm not going to get in depth about this, and it really does get more into watchmaking at this point. There's many videos out there. Maybe we'll convince Hans to hop on a video one day, but something you need to look out for is the amplitude. That's going to measure really the power keeping ability of the watch, and if it's not keeping power, that means that is an issue. There's some other issue in the watch, and that's being exhibited through the low power keeping ability. Maybe it's not winding, or maybe there's an issue with the spring or some of the gears that wind the watch. So you want to have an amplitude that's close to 300, but once again, like some of the other things I've mentioned and Will mentioned, it changes depending on the watch. So it can be very difficult to judge it just based on the amplitude. But if you're interested, pick yourself up a time grapher. This is something you can tinker around with, have a lot of fun, but I would say probably just trust a watchmaker because they do this every day and they know all the exceptions, and you won't drive yourself crazy over this because some people really do with these time graphers. Now next we get into heavy polish. Now if it's a very old watch, there's a chance that the watch is just heavily polished. Watches were luxury goods, watches were jewelry items. People wanted them to be shiny for decades. It's only within the last 5 years, maybe 10 years for the most scrupulous watch collectors, that people have decided to not polish their watches, to retain the original chamfers on the Rolex cases, to retain that original metal the way it was shipped, even though it may look a little bit dingy or beat up. People like that now, but they didn't. So the reality is you're going to come across so many watches that are polished or buffed, or the top layers of the metal have been removed, which is what happens when you polish a watch, or any piece of metal for that matter. It doesn't matter if you're polishing the stainless steel on your dishwasher. Technically, you're removing some top layers of the product. This is something that when you start seeing angles on the case be entirely gone and removed, it makes you scratch your head a little bit. Compare it to pictures of really known great examples of the watch online, and that could be an indicator of maybe the watch wasn't held and worked on by properly trained watchmakers. And that means that there could be an issue somewhere inside of the case. Sometimes you have these people that polish the watches and they really have no business behind a buffing and polishing wheel. I took in undergrad, I took a jewelry creation classes. They make you take all these electives. I took it twice, the 1 and 2, and I've used these buffing wheels and polishing wheels on jewelry. Never a watch. I would not do that. That would be ridiculous. I'm not trained in that by any manner, more so than my undergraduate coursework, which was, let's leave it at that. But I do understand that these wheels can really rip off like millimeters of metal in a second. And so when you start seeing that in the sheer amount of pressure, I would just say take a closer look, know what you're getting into. I don't recommend buying overly polished watches anyway, but it's another telltale sign of, hey, maybe there's something else going on inside of this watch, and you should take a closer look. Now, lastly, this one, there's differing opinions on this all the time, especially when people like to customize things and make things personal. Everything from straps, by the way, SinclairStraps.com, where you can find the best premium leather watch straps available from the same leather workers that produce the straps for your favorite brands. But aside from straps, people like putting diamond bezels, aftermarket bezels, changing out the dials. I see this all the time. I don't recommend doing it. I don't like it, but to each their own, right? But when I do see this, I know the types of people that modify these watches. I see the type of watchmakers and dealers that do this, and it's not always a great scenario. And so I would caution that if a watch is heavily modified, think blacked out, or they call it murdered out. When it's all black, I think if it's all matte black, maybe I think they call it murdered out. I don't know. It's a car thing. Someone leave that in the comments below. But when you start seeing these things done to these expensive items, these watches that we all love, generally someone is doing this to the watch that maybe isn't classically trained. Now, once again, not 100% sure that someone that doesn't know what they're doing touched on the watch, but I've just seen too many horror stories and I need to share this with you. If the watch has been heavily modified, look at it. Something else may not be right about the watch, and it could maybe only give you problems in the future, especially if something like a bezel is changed, which is going to detract or take away from the water tightness in the water depth rating for the water resistance on the watch. That just happens when you start messing with pieces of the case. But what do you guys think? Are there any other telltale signs, or perhaps you have had some horror stories on watches that you've purchased that ended up being lemons? I would love to see it and hear it down in the comments below. Perhaps I will even share with you some of these stories that you give to me and kind of broadcast them out to the world. I always love hearing about these things and helping where and when I can. Also, please do not forget to check out delraywatch.com and my Instagram, TheRealJohnP, where you can submit different questions to me and also things you'd like to see in the future. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.